Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Just a refresher, my name's Cole Blair. I'm the lead biologist with Wildlife Preservation Canada's Native Pollinator Initiative. And I'm continuing a series on everything to do with bumblebees, including the work we do with them, how you can be involved with things like community science, and ultimately how to identify bumblebees that you might find around you. I'm picking up here. We just finished off a a section on bumblebee colony cycles, and now I'm going to pick up into the work that we do in the Native Pollinator Initiative with bumblebees. So, within the Native Pollinator Initiative, we have our bumblebee recovery program. I've touched upon earlier, but it's described by four cornerstones of work that we contribute to. So, one is community science, which we'll talk about more later. We also engage in education and outreach events to spread the word about bees and the work we do with them and why they're so important and why their conservation matters so much. We also conduct our own research and monitoring through things like population surveys. But the most important part of our bumblebee recovery program is our conservation breeding program. So in this program, we're studying the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is listed federally here in Canada as special concern, in the hopes of rearing a large enough captive population that we can actually um, release some bees to bolster the declining wild populations. And again, um, this would also help with any future bumblebee species that might become imperiled. So hopefully being able to transfer what we learn by studying and breeding the yellow-banded bumblebee to other species in the future. So there's a lot going on here. Why bumblebees specifically? All of this effort that I described, why are we specifically doing this with bumblebees? There are a lot of other species that deserve recognition and assistance, but there are a couple of different reasons why we focus specifically with bumblebees in the bumblebee recovery program. The first reason is that unfortunately, our bumblebees are globally threatened. It's estimated that roughly 30% of bumblebee species may be at risk. In North America, this is also reflected with at least 12 species, which is representing a little over a quarter of our North American species, ranging from vulnerable to critically endangered. I've seen more recent assessments raising that estimation to around 40%. So somewhere between uh, a quarter and 40% of our North American bumblebees at some elevated extinction risk, ranging from vulnerable to critically endangered. Additionally, there are nearly just as many bumblebee species that are considered data deficient as there are species that are at risk of extinction. So just as many species that we truly don't know the conservation status of, data deficient, kind of meaning that just that they're either difficult to study enough, they're not very readily found, there's not enough existing information on them to truly tell us whether or not they're declining, whether they're stable, whether or not they need intervention for their conservation. Um, so why are bumblebees so imperiled? Why are they so increasingly at risk? And there's a few different reasons, and some of these might be familiar. One of them being habitat loss, which is another big stressor for most other imperiled species. So you can imagine the conversion of foraging resources and nesting and overwintering habitats, things like meadows or forests or all these different habitats that bumblebees might utilize, converting them to for urban or agricultural purposes is going to fragment and reduce the amount of habitat that is available to bumblebees. There are some species of bumblebees that responds very well to urbanization. They resist it quite well and they thrive in urban landscapes. But there are again some that don't. So um, habitat loss being a stressor for the species that at least are at risk of extinction. Another one that's common that we are likely aware of is climate change. So again, another common stressor to a lot of other different imperiled species. But with bees specifically, climate change might shift certain bumblebee species ranges. It might place them at the edge of their range. And it can also change the bloom time of floral resources. So it might lead to something called phenological mismatch, which is basically just the uncoupling of some closely tied organisms. In this instance specifically, it would be bumblebees with the flowers that they forage from. So an example that I like to give of this is if you imagine um, early spring had a really, really warm period, that warm period might trigger some bumblebees to wake up prematurely from their overwintering. And they might wake up early and find that um, the flowers around them haven't bloomed yet. So typically, for bumblebees to be successful in the early spring when the queens are emerging, they would need to be emerging at the same time that flowers are starting to bloom because they need those flowers to forage for pollen and nectar, not only to sustain themselves as individual queens, but also to initiate their colonies. So if phenological mismatch is occurring under climate change, then that really puts additional stress at this key points of their colony cycle and puts these queens at a lot of food stress. So climate change, depending on where you are and the range of the bees and what the species is, can provide some added stress to certain imperiled species. Pathogens and parasites is another one listed here. This might come to a shock to some, but there are a lot of diseases and pathogens and parasites um, that can be found in bumblebees. So, and other bees as well. Um, some bumblebees are managed commercially, not only honeybees, but some bumblebees are managed commercially, namely the common eastern bumblebee here in eastern North America. They're brought around to different greenhouses to pollinate things like tomatoes and blueberries and such. Same thing with commercialized honeybee hives. Honeybee hives might be installed at agricultural sites to pollinate their crops. Um, what can happen though is that these um, commercial bees, be them honeybees or bumblebees, they might house pathogens and parasites. And um, when bees are installed at agricultural settings, they won't only be um, foraging from the agricultural flowers, the agricultural crops that they're there to pollinate. They might forage from the adjacent wildflowers nearby, and they might be interacting with the wild bee species nearby. So a lot of the ways that these pathogens and parasites spread is through feces. So an infected bee might find their way over to the adjacent wildflowers, at the adjacent wildflowers. They might poop on a flower, and then a native bee might come along and forage from that same flower and be exposed to the parasites present in their feces. But the same can also happen in reverse. It's not just pathogens spilling over from managed colonies into wild populations, but it can also be the opposite trend, and it can also be happening simultaneously, creating this feedback loop of pathogen parasites growing in abundance in commercial and nearby wild populations of bees. So just like an infected bee can leave their commercial captivity and infect a wild bee, wild populations, same thing can happen again. In reverse, a wild bee might come into contact, a wild infected bee might come into contact with a commercial bee, and that commercial bee might bring that infection back to their colony where it replicates in abundance because there's a ton of bees in these commercial colonies, and then those spill back over and creating that loop. So pathogens and parasites can result in certain physiological effects. They can be associated in bumblebee specifically with things like reduced likelihood of surviving overwintering, lower likelihood of initiating a colony. They can also inhibit the cognition of bees, which is really important if we're thinking about bees' ability to gain enough resources to transition to the reproductive phase. So if they aren't able to um, acquire enough resources, they might not even get to that phase where they can reproduce, where they can produce males and gynes, and that would really prevent them from um, creating a next generation to make a colony in the next year. So, um, in combination with different stressors, especially pathogens and parasites, can be quite detrimental to bumblebee populations. And of course, agricultural chemicals. We're all familiar with things like neonicotinoids and their harm to bees. But along the same lines, exposure to these agricultural chemicals and pesticides can again lead to things like um, uh, um, cognition inhibition. So again, reducing their ability to forage. and things like that. So a litany of different stressors resulting in an increasingly imperiled community of bumblebees, unfortunately. So that's the first reason why we're so concerned with them. The second reason is that, um, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So not only are bees threatened globally, not only are bees threatened in North America, but bumblebees are also threatened in Canada. So these are a list of our species that are currently listed under our Species at Risk Act, um, ranging from special concern, threatened, endangered. Um, there's a few that I want to note here. So these are the ones that we are likely to, well, that were historically found and are still found in Ontario in some instances. The rusty patched, yellow-banded American Ashton cuckoo and Suckley's cuckoo. At one point, these were all found in Ontario. However, the rusty patched has not been observed in Canada since 2009. The Ashton cuckoo has not been observed in Ontario since 2008. Um, and the yellow-banded of the American bumblebees are still able to be found in Ontario and throughout different parts of Canada. However, they are declining. Specifically, the yellow-banded bumblebee is declining mostly in the southern parts of their Canadian range. Western bumblebee, broken down into two different subspecies, um, listed as threatened and special concern, respectively. But you won't find them um, where I am, at least in southern Ontario. These are more associated with BC and Alberta. So, again, not only are bees threatened globally, but also in our own backyards, bumblebees are increasingly imperiled. The list is growing. The most recent additions to our imperiled bumblebees came in 2023, where we had the additions of the American bumblebee and the Western bumblebee, both subspecies. They were both assessed by COSEWIC, which is the scientific body that assesses our wildlife here in Canada. And then those assessments made by COSEWIC then inform our Species at Risk Act, which is the legislation um, that kind of prohibits and protects or prohibits harassments to and also protects um, our endangered species. So um, the American bumblebee and the Western bumblebee were added to the Species at Risk Act only in 2023, so just a couple of years ago. So the list is growing. It has grown in recent years, and it has the potential to continue growing as well. We see the Suckley's cuckoo has been assessed as threatened by COSEWIC, but has not been listed under the Species at Risk Act yet. I'm recording this in August of 2025, so that might change in the future. But again, the list has grown in recent years, and the list has the potential to grow even more as bumblebees become increasingly threatened. The other reason why we're so concerned with bumblebees is that they are some of our best pollinators. They're generalist foragers, meaning that they can pollinate a large variety of flowers throughout the entire season. And tied to that is their long colony cycle, which we've discussed. So they're out very early in the spring and late in the fall. And because of their big, hairy bodies being more tolerant to the cold, they can also be out early in the morning and late in the day foraging from different flowers. And because they're a native pollinator, um, they've they've evolved this very tight evolutionary relationship with a lot of our native flowers, a lot of our native plants. And this is something called buzz pollination, which is essentially a variety of pollination. So just to preface this, we think of pollination as um, the reproduction of plants, the sexual reproduction of plants. So pollen grains, being the genetic material of male plants, need to fertilize female flowers. And a lot of flowers um, uh, recruits the aid of insects, including bees. So when you think of bee pollination, it's just bees going from flower to flower, picking up pollen, and some of those pollen grains fertilize female flowers of those same species to allow that flower species to reproduce, to allow those flower individuals to reproduce. So with buzz pollination, it is basically describing a specific form of pollination that just requires a higher energy input from the bee. So with some flowers that don't require buzz pollination, the pollen can be readily taken different bees and different insects can come and just take some and move along. Um, with flowers that require buzz pollination, the strategy here is basically all or nothing. If a bee cannot um, activate enough energy to create this pollen explosion, then they won't get any pollen. So it's really all or nothing. Bumblebees have evolved this method of buzz pollination. Some solitary native bees have also evolved buzz pollination. However, honeybees typically aren't able to do this. They can under certain circumstances, but if given the choice between flowers that don't need buzz pollination, so those easy meals, and flowers that do need buzz pollination, they will choose the ones that don't because the energy that they would need to put in to the flowers that need buzz pollination is not really worth it for the amount of pollen that they'd get out of it because they really wouldn't be able to get enough pollen from those flowers that need to be buzz pollinated. So what buzz pollination is describing on the bees end is essentially what I'll describe now in the case of bumblebees. So bumblebees will latch onto the flowers really, really tightly, and they do this. You can see them do this in videos and even in the wild. They like brace themselves for what they're about to do. And then they'll vibrate their flight muscles. So again, think back to how big bumblebees are in relation to other bees that we see. They have these very, 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 very big thoraxes with very, very well-developed, strong, large flight muscles. And those flight muscles are used to vibrate the wings, not for flight, but they vibrate the wings so intensely that their bodies basically vibrate, and that activation energy that is needed on the flower's end triggers a pollen explosion. So a bee grabs on and basically vibrates super, 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 super intensely, and that triggers the pollen in this flower to be released all at once in like a puff, a big poof of pollen, and just coat the bee head to toe in pollen grains. And so on the bee's end, this is fantastic. I just got a huge payday. This is a big meal. And on the flower's end, um, yes, some of the pollen is going to be eaten by the bee, but it's released so much pollen and has created such a big pollen explosion. It's dusted so much pollen onto this bee that if that bee were then to go and visit a female flower of that same species, it is a guarantee that some of those pollen grains will then fertilize that flower. So if you think again, back to flowers that don't need buzz pollination, that coating of the bee is not really likely to happen because the pollen grains are more readily available. And that lowers the odds of that individual bee pollinating another flower of that same species. However, again, if there are enough insects coming and taking pollen, that's just a game of numbers. All you need is one of them to do the job. But with the flowers that need buzz pollination, it's really just all or nothing. They just need one bee to do it, and that one bee is often going to be a bumblebee, and they'll get the job done. And so, why is buzz pollination so important to us? Well, it's not just that a bunch of our native flowers here in North America need them to reproduce. Um, so not only are they are these bees helping to maintain our terrestrial systems, but they're also helping to maintain our food systems. A lot of our food crops that we take for granted need buzz pollination. Tomatoes are a great example. So I mentioned before that bumblebees, specifically the combination bumblebee, can be shipped around commercially and installed into greenhouses to pollinate things like tomatoes and blueberries, but also other crops like squashes. They need buzz pollination. So the diagram on the bottom left here, we see a greenhouse with low bush blueberries planted. If this were my greenhouse and I were to install honeybees to pollinate my blueberries would not be sufficiently pollinated. I would need bumblebees. And that's because blueberries evolved here in North America. They evolved a very tight pollination relationship with bumblebees, and honeybees are not from here. Honeybees did not evolve alongside our tomatoes and blueberries. Bumblebees did, and other native bees did. So you would need bumblebees to pollinate your blueberries, your tomatoes, your squashes. Our grocery store produce aisles would look a lot different if it weren't for bumblebees. And so another reason why we're so concerned with bumblebees is to protect their biodiversity, protect our wild systems, and protect our food systems.